Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we have a friend and someone we've had on the podcast before. In fact, it was almost exactly 3 years ago, we had this guy on the podcast, our friend Dan. Episode number 38, we were talking with him about some of the personal growth journeys that he was going through, some of the changes he was making in his life, some of the ahas he had by going through way back in the olden days of Intuitive Awakening program, and some of the stuff from his personality type. And we thought we'd invite him back on today to talk about this progression that's been happening for him over the last few years and where he's at now.
Yeah, so we should probably actually welcome you to the show as opposed to just say, you're on. So welcome back, Dan. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back for, is this Dan part 2? Is that?
Yeah. Dan part 2 sounds good. When we were talking before the podcast started, you mentioned that when you were on the show previously, and you're in the Myers-Briggs personality type system, you're an INFP, and you were talking a lot about moving away from pain in your life in the previous podcast. And we talked a little bit about how the last 3 years of your journey has been actually moving toward good things, moving towards pleasure, moving towards exploration. And you've done some pretty big feats in the last 3 years that have illustrated your commitment to being willing to do that. So can you just tell us a little bit about how you pivoted from going away from pain and unhappiness and how you pivoted toward going towards pleasure and happiness?
Yeah, so when we left off a few years ago, I was in the middle of doing a bunch of exploration around the country, in the U.S. here, and kind of using your place as a launching pad for a lot of that journeying, and was getting ready to head up to New England. So I continued with that for quite a while, and actually ended up over the course of 9 months, in 2 weeks out of 6, I was traveling around and getting to places I hadn't been before and meeting people and having a lot of fun and a lot of fantastic experiences that way. And then I kind of came to the conclusion at a certain point that this was a lot more the life I wanted to live than what I'd been doing. I had a really good job, like a career path, really solid company, real great benefits, all of that good stuff. And what I realized was that was the part of my life that wasn't keeping up with the level of the rest of my life, where I was feeling more engaged than I'd ever been before. My comfort zone had stretched tremendously, and I just was finding a level of satisfaction with life and personal happiness, and also a just more positive view of myself than I'd ever had before. So what I ended up doing was deciding that I was going to leave that career, and that I wanted to have some even greater adventures. So as it turned out, I gave my notice and I left that job. I also just kind of went full bore for the whole thing, sold my house, and started just basically full-time adventuring. And that's kind of what I've been doing for most of the last 3 years since the previous podcast episode. So that involved a lot of just like road trips and meeting up with people and making new friends, doing a lot of hiking, checking out a lot of national parks I hadn't been to before. In the process of all this, out of the blue, I had this fantastic experience that I fell in love with photography. And I'd done some before in the past, but it was like my exploration gave me this opportunity to dive into it like never before, and it's become a great passion of mine. And also in the process of this, I decided I love hiking and being in nature so much that I want to just do it a lot. So I decided I wanted to do a long distance hike. I was looking at doing the Pacific Crest Trail. Timing didn't work out well with that. So I ended up last summer, I hiked the Appalachian Trail, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, here in the U.S., there's several long trails, and this was the first of them. And it goes from Maine, Mount Katahdin in Maine, to Springer Mountain in Georgia. It's roughly 2,190 miles long. So that's something like 4,000 kilometers for those using measurements that make sense. And so I started that in July and did that for the next 5.5 months or so until January of this year. And I finished that whole adventure, which was amazing.
So I want to get into some of the personal growth stuff that you want to talk about here today. But first, I know that you're an INFP in the Myers-Briggs system. So this was a really, like all of the stuff you've been doing the last 3 years, obviously was getting into that co-pilot cognitive function process for you, which is extroverted intuition. We've nicknamed it exploration. You're literally exploring the world, the U.S. You're traveling, you're hiking, and I'm imagining you listening right now. If you're an INFP listening, or maybe other personality types, but especially an INFP listening, you are so envious of Dan because he's been able to just basically be off the grid, do something he's passionate about artistically, which is photography, be out in nature, go hiking, explore the world. I'm jealous of this in some ways as an ENFP even, but I'm imagining that like someone listening right now is hearing this and going, man, I would love that life. So would you be able to just kind of give a quick, the first question I would be asking if I was listening is, how did you facilitate that? How did you not have to work? How is that even possible for you? And how did you make that happen? Because I'm sure people are listening going, I would love to do something like that.
So one of the things that happened as I was spending a lot of time exploring was I got a lot greater clarity on the things that I really cared about and was passionate about. And so that allowed me to cut out of my life a lot of things that really weren't adding any significant value to it, including owning a home, which for a lot of people, that's a great thing. And it gives them a great sense of security and stability. For me, it felt like an anchor that was keeping me trapped down and keeping me from having greater joy and happiness in my life. So I was like, well, I don't really need to have a home. I don't need to own one. So, selling that, and then lots of other things that I own that I just started getting rid of. And so my life got really, really simple. And I think that was a really important part of it. People are like, I can't afford to travel. It's, I've got all these bills and stuff. And I'm not trying to invalidate somebody's situation if they have financial stress, but just from my own personal experiences, stripping out all the things that weren't adding any value and simplifying was a huge part of it, because it gets a lot less expensive to live and to be able to fund yourself when you don't have you don't have monthly payments. I don't carry debt. Just keep everything really simple. I don't buy things on payments and that sort of thing. And so getting that cost down, and then, largely I've been, I lived off of the proceeds from the sale of my house for quite a while. I sold a vehicle that I didn't need anymore. And so there's funds from that. And then I've picked up a little bit of odds and ends of income here and there to sustain that. Now, of course, that isn't ultimately sustainable, that method. So I'm working on some things that have come up for me idea-wise to sustain this going forward. And I feel like I'm in a really great place to do that, because I've got this mode of life that I've learned to live where it's inexpensive, it's simple, and I'm focusing my resources, both internal and external resources, on things that I really care about and really add a lot to my life.
Well, and I think another thing that comes on sort of the heels of this as well is that you've never been afraid of really hard work. And so even when we were talking last time and you were on the podcast, you were doing a job that required you to work for a full month straight, like 10-hour days, and then... Or 12-hour days. Okay. It was on the slope in Alaska. And so it was a very intense construction job that you did, but then that freed you up for 2 weeks to go travel. And I know that helped you put some money in the bank as well. So I think a part of this isn't like you're just one of those people who's always been freeform and you just, you sort of have always kept your life simple. Like the reason why you had a house and a second car that you didn't need and all that is because you've always pursued hard work, banked some, and then when you realized that the exact way in which that was happening wasn't contributing to your happiness, you started trimming all the fat. But there was fat to trim because you had poured so much of yourself into that. So I think a big piece of this is not forgetting how much hard work actually went into all this. It was hard. It was on the foundation of hard work, and then a philosophy that made it so that when you were able to trim the fat, you still had all those resources. You still had the ability to do that. And what I find so fascinating is that it's not like you're not doing hard work now, in the sense of when you went and did the Appalachian Trail, that was a ton of hard work. There are a lot of stories in there that indicate just how much resource you needed as an individual. So I think a big piece of this is not overvaluing that sort of, oh, I'm just going to go travel and I'm going to go take pictures and it's going to be awesome and I don't need a house. I mean, it's actually the foundation of all of this is having been such a hard worker and having invested so much of yourself in building that skill of being able to build resource. And then when you were able to transcend that place, you still have that as a ballast. You still have that to go back to if you need to. And I think that that's kind of a piece of a lot of these stories that gets glossed over, which is that you can just go live the life you've always wanted to, and it's no big deal. And every person I've seen that has successfully been able to do that has gone through a time period of understanding and learning the need for hard work and doing whatever it takes, even if it's not particularly glamorous or even if it's backbreaking or whatever it is. You've built the skill of being able to work that hard. And so when you do this, it's not just like you've become some sort of professional Kato Kalin where you're just sleeping on people's couches. Like, you have the ability to build your own resource.
Yeah, I worked very hard to become homeless and unemployed. That was a long, hard work to get there, to achieve that goal. Yeah. And I got there, so whoo, go me. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It was hard work, and it was a process to get there. Like, I had these dreams and ideas for quite a while before I achieved them. So, I just worked through it one step at a time and eventually made it happen. And then, yeah, when I'm hiking 2,000 miles, there is a tremendous amount of work there. And part of the reason why I think that journey was successful for me was because I was willing to do that. And then the other thing I thought of when you were just saying that is you can work hard for things you don't care about and spin your wheels, and they will probably lead to frustration, and they're certainly not going to add happiness. Having a nicer car because someone's going to be impressed by that, having a home that's like in a nice neighborhood and all that if it doesn't mean anything to you is for what you think you should do and those kinds of things. Or you can work hard and have a greater return on that investment because you're working hard at things that motivate you, that fulfill you, and just enrich in your life in every way.
And that even includes working hard in something that you might not particularly want to do in the moment for a return later. Because I know a big part of the planning phase for being able to currently live this life is that you actually, you did the career you didn't particularly want to do for quite a while after you realized you didn't want to do it. And it was because you wanted to make sure that you had set yourself up in as sustainable a way as possible before you made those changes. So it's not like you just... it's not like you just went one day like, screw this, I don't want to do this anymore, and you just pieced out. It was like, it was a plan, and then you moved on the plan, and then you were able to get yourself to a place where you could live the life that you truly wanted to. And I think that that's a really important key point. If you didn't have anything else, Joel, at this moment, I kind of want to talk about the Appalachian Trail. I want to talk about your experiences doing that, because that's a pretty epic adventure that not everybody gets to do in a lifetime, which is travel, over 2,000 miles, or like you said, 4,000 kilometers, did you say, approximately?
Roughly, yeah.
That's a pretty big feat. And I think what's so fantastic about that is, especially as an INFP, it probably felt like a little overwhelming in the beginning, in the planning phase. And even when you were there, you had some experiences that were a little overwhelming. But I think this sort of, this idea of the characteristics that you had to work on and build seems to have gotten you through a lot of that. So can you kind of speak on like what, did the planning phase overwhelm you, or was it really huge, or what were some of in the pre-phase, what were some of the resistances you had to get over in yourself? And then we can talk about what happened actually on the trail.
Okay. So the planning went back quite a ways before I started, hiking that great long distance. Oh, by the way, just for the sake of your accuracy, I realize it's more like 3,500 kilometers. So you're
okay.
your accuracy would want me to correct that.
It would. It's very grateful. Thank you.
But I started looking at the stuff you have to plan, and at first, it was a little overwhelming. I think that planning is a challenge for INFPs and other similar types, because you end up dipping into parts of your function stack, your personality that you're maybe not as skilled at, extroverted thinking and introverted sensing and that sort of thing. So what I learned, amongst many things I learned in this process, was break it down as simple as you need to do it. And give yourself permission to break it down like kindergarten level simple, if that's what you have to do. So you're not getting overwhelmed, because there's a goal in mind here. And if I want to achieve that, I've got to do certain things. So, as an example, I'm like, okay, I don't know where I'm going to get my resources food-wise and water and stuff like that when I'm on the trail. So I start doing some searching online, and I find out that there is a particular guidebook that is like the favorite for people who do this hike, and everybody recommends it. It's only $9 for the digital version of it. So I go ahead and I get that and just start looking at what information is available. I'm like, okay, so now I have this resource that check that off. That gives me information. So what are my needs going to be when I'm doing this? So I break that down real simple. I'm going to need the right clothing that fits what's going on here. And I'm going to need, a setup for camping at night and other miscellaneous gear. And I've done backpacking before, so that was kind of, I'd already learned that part of the skill. I was not new to that. I'm going to need to be able to get food while I'm hiking, in some form or another. And I'm going to need to be able to get water. So just started looking at those things one thing at a time. And then as I'm doing that, a few other concerns start coming up that I had just found in research. Well, instead of, letting those things kind of get overwhelming, I just kind of make a note on that and just had a very simple list that got really granular on things like, okay, what am I going to do about coffee? Because I need coffee in the morning. And what am I going to do about snacks while I'm hiking? Because I know when I'm backpacking, I want to have snacks with me readily accessible. How am I going to make sure I hydrate enough? So really granular, break it down, which is a skill that I really kind of honed there that has continued to serve me since then. Anytime that you're working on something and you feel overwhelmed by it, and this applies to everybody of every type, that's the recommendation I give, is give yourself permission to just simplify, break it down, no matter how small you need to do. And that's what I did for all of the planning. And I had a master list of the lists I needed to make up. And then I had those sub lists, and and then you can only just focus on one thing at a time instead of looking at the whole elephant you're trying to eat. You just look at the bite you're taking right then.
And so did you have at any point, did you get overwhelmed by the task of just pre-planning, or were you able to implement that philosophy to a point where you just didn't let yourself get overwhelmed?
I think I was getting overwhelmed at first, and that's where I started to implement that and saw how that corrected that problem. I was like, okay, there's so much I got to figure out. I mean, it's a long time frame. It's a long distance. There's, the very specific needs. There are safety concerns that are very serious. And so that exercise was a real great kickoff for that, because I started out overwhelmed and like, okay, I really am going to do this, I'm determined. So I just started breaking things down and then unoverwhelmed from there. So
basically determination just sort of had you break through any sort of overwhelm. Like you were just, I'm going to do this. So just better get to stepping.
Yeah, that's one of the INFP superpowers. Some people may be aware of, is it takes us forever to make a decision, but once that decision is made, we're kind of like a force of nature at that point. You just can't get in the way, because that's been chewed on a lot to get to that point, and then the determination is just there.
Yeah. So then, when you actually went into the mode of getting on the trail, what were some of your I know what some of your biggest ahas are, because we've talked about them extensively, and especially your number one aha, which I kind of want to touch on in just a moment. But what were some of the experiences you had on the trail that were pretty profound and helped you sort of reframe how you saw things? Because I'm imagining that doing a hike like the Appalachian Trail is an identity changer. Like, you don't come out the end of it the same way that you started out.
Yeah, and I think everybody who does some big adventure like that does it for different reasons. And for me going into it, it was one of the big reasons was I wanted to just have that experience of being surrounded in nature and beauty for a long period of time. But I also wanted to use that opportunity to feed my exploration, my introvert or my extrovert intuition, to the end of getting clarity on myself, bigger picture. And so the what I'm talking about there and getting that clarity is I had started to have this kind of gut sense that I wanted to do something a little bigger in my life and contribute more towards this world and the people in it in a bigger way than I have been, that there was something more I had to say. And so I was hoping that having that experience would give me some clarity in that regard as well. And it turned out that it did. It took me quite a while and there was a lot of sorting, but when it got there, it was an amazing experience that I don't think everybody gets in their life, where they just, you get that internal alignment through the whole core of your being, like, yes, this is what I'm about. And this is what I have to bring to this world.
Can you name what some of those were?
So, just a little bit of background. I played around with different ideas on things I could put out to the world creatively. And I talked about maybe doing a podcast on like outdoor adventuring and hiking and that sort of thing. And, those things kind of sounded nice. But really I was looking for, what is the thing I have to say? What is my message? That's the main message I want to get across. And so as I had been doing all this, I've been, of course, taking lots and lots of pictures because that's my big passion artistically. And I post them on Instagram. And of course, when you post something on Instagram, you typically put a bunch of hashtags as to what the point of the picture is or the subject or whatever. And so I'm hiking somewhere. This is quite a ways into it. I think probably, I want to say around the 1,700 mile mark. And it just occurred to me one day, like, I've been telling myself what my message is the entire time, and I've been posting it in a hashtag in my Instagram account with almost every single picture I posted had this same hashtag. And that hashtag that I was using is beauty is everywhere. And it occurred to me that this is the message that I have to bring to this world. This is why I'm on this planet. I was living in this world where everything was beautiful and amazing. The people were just over the top amazing, and maybe we can talk about that some more in a little bit. But not tons of natural beauty. Not every day was easy. Some were really, really tough, but the overall experience was absolutely amazing. And I was having this life absorbed in this beautiful world. And then periodically I would get to civilization and take a break to, maybe take a day off and stay at a hostel or something and get a shower, which was a rare occasion, and do some laundry and all that. And I'd check in with the rest of the outside world, get on Facebook and all this. Well, this was during the election cycle, the national election cycle here in the United States. And I get online and everybody is in turmoil. And people are clearly in a lot of pain, and they're seeing lots of things that are very ugly to them. And then I would go back out into nature with my fellow hikers and the critters and everything is beautiful. And so what kind of came from that is this understanding that we're really, really not appreciating how much beauty is out there for us in so many different ways. The beauty in nature, the beauty in people, the beauty in so much in our world that it's there, but we're constantly getting distracted away from it for all kinds of different reasons. And so whatever method that I'm going to use going forward, and I've got some different ideas in mind, specific methods, but that's the message that I came to understand. And when I understood that, I'm like, yes, this is absolutely why I belong on this planet, because people aren't aware just how beautiful our world is and the people on it. And I need to remind them of that.
Yeah, you mentioned that you had pretty much like 100% good experiences with people on the trail.
Yeah, the baseline was polite, and it went from polite to amazing. People were so kind to me in so many ways, helped me out in so many ways. Some of whom may actually be even listening to this podcast. Like, for instance, in New Hampshire, I stayed with the family there, the Helfrich family. So, hi, guys. Thank you so much for putting me up. I was hiking through because they live right off the trail. Had a great time with them. I had people, give me food, offer me rides, just randomly pull up and give me like a cold soda or something as I'm crossing a road. And I think a lot of people around those areas are aware of people doing that adventure, and they love to support that. They love to be a part of it, even though they're not hiking themselves. There's something very inspiring about seeing somebody take on a huge, huge goal and be determined to see it through. And so people love to participate in that.
Speaking of people, you have also been using the last 3 years to build more of a social circle, more of a connection with other people. Being an introvert, often it can be a challenge for you. If you're listening and you're an introvert, obviously you know very well what it's like to move in the world of people and try to figure out, okay, who's my tribe? How do I get along with people? Not get along like you're hard to get along with, but how do I make sure I can show up in the world and not be overwhelmed by this experience? And Dan, what you did also is you, with the Appalachian Trail and also some of the other travel you've been doing, you went into our Intuitive Awakening group and you reached out to people on the Facebook community, the personality hacker community, and said, hey, I'm going to be hiking the Appalachian Trail. Anybody want to hike, short periods of it with me? Daytime, a day trip or a couple overnights or even a week, whatever. And you opened yourself up to meeting strangers. I mean, you know them online through some of the Facebook groups and some of the community, but you've never met them in person. And then you carried that not only on the trail, but also in your other journeys around the country and around the world. So explain to me what that was like. Because as an introvert, that's a really unique way to build your tribe of like minds.
Yeah, so I had already at that point learned a lot about how valuable it was for me to stretch my comfort zone. Because every time I had done that, significantly great things came from it. And so when I decided I was going to go into this time period of just adventuring and do this big hike and a bunch of other travel, I had this thought of like, let's stretch this comfort zone. I'd gotten comfortable with adventuring and exploring, but I hadn't, I'd only just started really focusing on making connections with people as I was doing this. And so I made a post on the Intuitive Awakening group, which was a lot younger then and smaller. I think, I'm not sure exactly when that group got started, but at the time it was considerably smaller than it is now. And I made a post about my plans to adventure. And I started, the first line was, I want you to come adventuring with me. And because I know how to market to intuitives, that's a line that I think grabbed people's attention. And I got an amazing response, lots and lots of support. And basically, I was describing the things I was going to be doing and some of the places I was going to be in. It was an open invitation to literally anyone who read it to participate in that in whatever way they could. If they wanted to join me in a part of a hike, or if they wanted to just meet up for coffee as I'm traveling through, or follow me on Instagram or Facebook and see my adventures and all that. And I got just an amazing response. I had lots of people say, yeah, I'm such and such a place. It's kind of near where you're going to be. Love to meet up with you. And other people were like, I'm not anywhere near where you're going to be at this point, but I want to support what you're doing because I think it's so amazing. So I'd like to, I want to follow you along and see your pictures and all this stuff. So they did that. And then, so as I've been traveling into this, I've taken advantage of that and I've reached out to people, and it hasn't always worked out timing wise. Sometimes, there's a little bit of challenge there and planning people's schedules, but a lot of times it has worked out. And I've met just a great group of people, in all these different ways. I've done some hikes with people. I had people invite me to stay in their homes. That's happened more than once. And they just know me online. So it's a tremendous amount of trust, and just people meet up and have a bite to eat with me or a cup of coffee and some great conversation. And every one of those experiences has been wonderful. And then, And then I've continued even after that hiking adventure to do that sort of thing. It's been fantastic. The community of people who are interested in developing themselves, the people that are following your podcast and in the Facebook community and all that, and like on the Intuitive Awakening group and following Personality Hacker, they're such a wonderful, open-minded, just fascinating group of people. And you will always have at least a really interesting conversation with anybody you meet up with from that group. And you may end up forming a fantastic friendship. I've formed really good friendships with some of the people that I met that I continue to enjoy.
So there's a couple different major things that came from this for you. Like, you decided as an INFP that you wanted to get clarity on your message. And so you just did this humongous adventure not knowing how it would inform that message, which I think is that's a lot of what ends up happening when we're developing that co-pilot process, is that we just have to start doing it, right? It's like, it's not necessarily whether or not we have this major game plan or how we have clarity around how it's all going to work out, but that we're trusting the process, which is what you did. You trusted the process. You did the biggest Goliath adventure or exploration that you could with your co-pilot process. And then out of that emerged clarity. And one of those clarities is that, there's beauty everywhere. And another element of clarity that you got from that, which you were telling me, was that you realized that people don't always get their needs met, mostly because they're not sure what those needs are, and in large part because they don't have clarity on what actual human needs are, just in general. And you told me a story of kind of a dicey situation, which was very clarifying for you on the subject of what human needs actually are. Would you be willing to share the story?
Certainly. So there were times on that hike where things got tough, and there were a few days when it was honestly miserable. I was hiking in really bad weather and downpours and things like that. That didn't happen a lot, but it did happen some. And, so those things happen when you have that kind of adventure. And if nothing else, they're a great story later. But anyway, one day things got real, and it was kind of like it was definitely a survival situation. So I'd been hiking all day in this kind of drizzly rain, and this was later on, and I was up in the kind of the mountains in North Carolina, and so this is December and high elevation, and it was cold and rainy, and so I was soaked. And I had planned where I was expecting to camp that night. And so when you're planning that sort of thing, you maybe don't do that too many days in advance because you don't know exactly how far you're going to get always. So, but by each day, by the time I started out, I wanted to have an idea of where camping was going to be. And I'm looking for places that not only are suitable for camping, but hopefully have water nearby. Even if it's cold, you're burning so many calories and stuff that water is huge in your radar.
Yeah. How many miles a day were you traveling right now?
At this point, I was averaging about 20 miles a day.
Okay. So 20 miles a day is like, what, you're traveling like 8 hours a day, basically?
No, probably closer to 10. I was averaging about 2.5 miles an hour, but you stop for lunch and rest and that sort of thing. So about close to 10 hours a day of hiking time with breaks and all that. And so it's getting toward the end of the day, and sometimes things happen. There's bad terrain sections or whatever, and so you get slowed down. And this happened here, where the latter part of the day was taking a lot longer than I had anticipated. So I'd looked at the guidebook, and there was a spot that was supposedly suitable for camping and also had a spring there. And I'd been having trouble getting water. It had been a really dry summer, and even though it was drizzly rain that day, the streams had mostly dried up. But the springs in those mountains had been a lot more reliable for me. So I was kind of counting on the springs to get my water supply. And so there was a spring right there by it, and it seemed like a good spot. So as it turned out, like I said, the latter part of that day, I got slowed way down for various reasons. So as I'm getting close to where I'm going to stop for the night, it's now after dark, and I'm hiking in the dark with my headlamp, and this really thick fog starts rolling in. So I could literally only see 4 to 5 feet in front of me. And I'm trying to find this little marker for a spring. Because things took longer, I ran out of water. And that's a really big deal. You can't keep going very long burning that kind of energy and not get water. So I'm concerned about that. And then the temperature just plummets. And it plummeted a lot. So I'm kind of a little bit frantically trying to figure out where this little side trail to go after the spring is. And also I know I need to set up my camp somewhere, and I'm getting pretty cold. And I had this moment of like, it's I think it's the only time when I've consciously been aware that I was now at Maslow's level 1. This was a survival situation, and I had to act with determination and clarity because this was no joke, that my life was actually on the line here. And so I didn't panic. I kind of broke it down. Okay, I need to get water, and I need to get a place where I can camp warm for the night and make that happen. So I get to this spot, find the spring, and the spring is dry. So I'm like, oh my goodness, this is really not good now. It's getting really cold. So I start this following down the side of this ravine because we're up at the top of this ridgeline area. And I start following this little ravine where the spring was downhill, pushing through thick brush and scrub that there was no trail. And I'm breaking branches around me trying to follow this down, hoping I can find a pool of water. I go several hundred yards down in there, and I hear the slight sound of a trickle. And I realize that under the branches and all that, under the scrub brush, there's rocks down there, and I hear water trickling down in there.
And you're still kind of almost effectively blind because of the fog, right? Like,
yeah.
You still can't see anything.
Yeah.
So you're like really relying on your hearing at this point to identify where water is because you can't see jack.
Yeah. So fortunately I heard it. And so I dug down in the rocks and found a trickle of water coming through, and I formed this little pool so the water could collect in there so I could scoop it out. And I let this pool form, and my first thought was that I would let it calm down for a little bit until the silt, because I'd stirred up all this silt and muck and stuff. So the water was really silty that was forming in this pool, and I thought, well, I'll let it calm down for a little bit before I get water out of there because I don't want it to plug up my water filter. So I was waiting a little bit, and then I'm realizing this is taking a long time, and I'm soaking wet and I'm really cold. Now I'm standing still, which is now that, that's when I really feel it. And so I'm like, I can't wait for this. So I had this simple little plastic funnel. I took one of my bandanas, stuffed it down in there, and scooped water out and poured it through my bandana into my water bottle to pre-filter to get the most of the bigger chunks of yuck out of it. Then filled up that water bottle there, run that through my filter, did that about 5 or 6 times because I not only needed water right then to drink, but I needed water for that night, the next morning, and until I could get water tomorrow, the next day. So I do this, get enough water finally through this double filtration process, shove everything back in my pack, scramble my way back up to the top of the ridge. And now when I get up there, it's well below freezing, and all the fog is starting to freeze on trees and grasses and all this stuff. And I'm still soaking wet. And that was the second moment of, oh my goodness, I need to get out of these wet clothes like right now. No joke. And fortunately, before I had gone down the hill, I'd spotted a good place to set up my camp. So I went over there and I threw my pack down and I just started ripping stuff out of it till I get to I had a set of clothes that I kept double protected from water, that and my sleeping bag kind of in the core of my backpack to make sure that they always stayed dry. Got down there, stripped naked in the freezing forest in the dark, and put on warm clothes, set up. I actually use a hammock for camping, not a tent. So I set up my hammock, sat in there with my sleeping bag wrapped around me, and then got my core temperature back up to where I wasn't shaking so hard, and then fixed my dinner and stuff. And so I got that need met, got warm enough, spent the night there. I was fine. And the next morning, everything I had was frozen, including my shoes. I hiked out of there with frozen shoes. And there was the fog rolling in as I've been freezing on the trees formed something called hoarfrost. If you're not familiar with that, you can do a Google image search. But it's these long, spiky crystals that grow. And it was about 1.25 inches, so something like close to 4 centimeters of hoarfrost sticking straight out of all the sides of the trees. It was eerily beautiful, but that was like the beautiful little culmination to the scary night. It was the next morning, waking up to this incredible, unique kind of beauty that I'd never seen before.
Yeah, and the conversation we had, which I've heard the story before, which is why I'm not like, oh my gosh, freaking out, because it's such a crazy story. But one of the things you mentioned is that you got really clear on human needs. And can you just, before we wrap up, because I know we have to wrap the podcast up, but before we do that, can you just kind of speak a little bit on your philosophy about human needs based on some of these experiences on the trail?
Yeah, so that was the other big thing I got from all this was when you get down to level 1 Maslow of survival, and even level 2 to a large extent, even if you're intentionally putting yourself in that situation, you get a lot of clarity on what your needs are. They're not complicated. And you also get a tremendous amount of permission that you give yourself automatically without even thinking about it to meet those needs. And that's what I learned is there's 3 things we need to have to meet our needs. We need to understand what those needs actually are. We need to give ourselves permission to meet that need. And then we need a strategy to meet that need. So that's real simple at Maslow's level 1. As we go up and we start getting into things like love and belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization, it gets a lot more complicated, but we need those same 3 things. And so it gave me a great reframe on like, where am I right this second in Maslow's pyramid? And what is the need that I really have? How do I identify what is a need versus what is mental clutter and somebody else's template? And then giving myself permission to make that need a priority. And that's another thing is that permission comes with giving ourselves the freedom to make our own needs a priority. We have to do that. No matter what demands are upon us, no matter what our family situation is, if we don't make our own needs a priority, they're not going to get met. And then we simply will not be able to keep giving in the best way we can. We will never be able to reach that self-actualization. And so that just gave me such a great understanding of how to mentally approach that using that model to get needs met in my life in general. And then I've had some opportunities to do a little bit of mentoring and coaching with people and sharing that with them. I've gotten great feedback on how that concept resonates.
Thanks, Dan, for being on today. I think this is good stuff. I think what I would like for you to do, if you're listening right now, is this idea of needs, getting your needs met. I think that's the takeaway from this episode. I think the things you talked about, knowing what those needs are, giving yourself permission, and then finding a strategy. I think a good step would be to identify something in your life right now that you feel is a need going unmet. It's something that maybe you have realized for a while. Maybe it's a new aha you've just had. Maybe you have to think about it a little bit to know where that need is going unmet. But I'd love to invite you to come over to personalityhacker.com, and below this podcast, let's get a conversation started around that idea of figuring out where your needs are that maybe you need to put more attention to. Do you know what they are? Have you given yourself permission to focus on them? And what kind of strategies could you maybe employ to get that need met? So maybe just pick one thing in your life. Let's start a conversation here in the community and see if we can get some ideas going and share some things. You can do that over also at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
Yeah, before I hawk the podcast, though, I just want to thank you, Dan, for being on again and sharing your experiences of living kind of a pretty epic life for an INFP.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great as always.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.